So I made a typographic poster recently called I'm Already Falling. Now this uses a combination of serif and sans serif typefaces. So I'm going to walk you through it on Photoshop of how I've made it to see if you've missed any steps. So let's jump in. Okay, so here we have the final poster design that I've recently made. So this is a good combination of sans serif and serif typefaces, as well as a few kind of shape assets and some cool fabric textures over the top that really ties it all in together. So as I zoom in, you can see the details here. It's kind of got this distressed look. You can see here, this looks as if it was made using analog techniques. You know, the texture really does its work here. There's a few cool shapes up here. We even have an image with some sort of Xerox grain effect going on as well. So let's jump into a new canvas. I'm going to walk you through all these techniques. So 3840, 4800 pixels, 300 resolution, standard. Okay, so now I'm going to use grid lines here. So I'm going to come up to View, Guides, New Guide Layout. Now I found that quite a high count of columns and rows was very useful here, especially for organizing a whole bunch of type. So 100 pixel gutter and margin, 5-7 columns and rows. First thing I started working on were these kind of larger type assets. So these are subtitles. So let me just type in the start, which is the word I'm. Now the typeface I've used as the kind of scripture serif looking font is Ivy Presto Display. And now I've used thin italic for this, and I've made sure that we are not working in uppercase. So let me set the tracking back to 0. The trick with making this serif font work so well is bringing the tracking in. So if I'm going to make this bigger and just type in I'm Already Falling, set this to a center align, you can see that right now, you know, it kind of just looks like a standard serif font, but as soon as you bring in the tracking to maybe -50 and it kind of tightens the lettering, it looks a lot sleeker. You know, I think the aesthetic really works, especially when you're combining it with sans serif typefaces. So let me just cut this out and I'm going to set it just to the word I'm. Okay. Now for each individual word, I'm going to be using a different text layer just for the sake of being able to edit easier as well as organizing. So now if I'm just going to turn this from a thin italic into a thin here, so that we get a little bit of contrast going on. I'm going to fit this italic piece of text just in the spacing of the word. And now for the word falling, we're just going to duplicate this, drag it over, type in the word falling, and then a general rule for balancing type is just use jump up 2 weights or jump down 2 weights. It's a great way to balance it all together. So for example, I'm going to jump up 2 weights. I'm going to go from thin to light to regular. And then because I wanted italic, I'm just going to do normal italic. And there we go. That gives you some good contrast. I'm just going to cut this to a lowercase f. So now with this, I'm going to group it and just name this I'm IAF. Especially when you're working with typographic layouts and you have lots of individual layers, make sure that you keep your layers organized the whole way through because it's going to save you so much time towards the end. And now I'm just going to change my auto select from group to layer here so I can copy individual layers. I'm going to duplicate this already text, drag this out of the folder, change this to greater good. Now I'm just going to drag this over to the right hand margin, maybe just into the list left one here so it's not fully on the right hand side. Duplicate this I'm text, and now in brackets, I'm going to type in for the. Now in terms of sizing here, I want this slightly smaller, so I'm going to use the golden ratio to scale this down. So come over to the point size, divide by 1.618. Now I'm going to drag this within the same kind of negative spacing gap. Now just for this small body text you can see here, there's just a few contrasting typefaces and weights. So if I'm just going to paste in this text box from how I've made it, I'm just going to show you how I've formatted it here. So I've just created a text box as normal. And now simply to create these indents, all I've done is at the start of a new line, press tab a few times. And now if it jumps too far of a gap, you can obviously just backspace and go back, or you can use the space bar for smaller gaps. But I'll just use this tab indent, create a new line, create a little bit of varying size gaps between the start of the lines. Now it kind of just helps readability, especially if you're working diagonally downwards. So you can see it like flows freely from top left to bottom right. And now through each one, I can just change. See, for example, this is thin italic, so I can just change it to italic, change this to a little bit bolder, increase the size slightly. And then from this point, I'm just going to shift around the placement. Just line it up with this grid line here. Now again, you can already see these grid lines I'm not already sticking to too well. Again, it's just as a loose guide to kind of get me a rough idea of where I'm structuring items. I'm just going to create another body text paragraph here. I'm going to paste in the actual type. So you can see here how I formatted it. You can see this tab gap. Now this tab gap is clearly for when I've tried to create a gap at the start of the line just here. So now you can see it. So in order to kind of structure this so that it's an ideal readability, I'm looking at kind of like breaks within the line. So for example, there's a comma here. So if there's a comma here, I'm going to shift the "and" onto the next line using shift and enter. Then I'm going to fix the spacing here. Again, full stop after pulling resistance. So this can be a new line. So from this point, I'm going to use tab to kind of create this indent here. Mass equals to mass. So we can keep that on this line because it's already a separate one and it's got some contrast between the last line break. Again, comma there, comma there. So I'm going to shift this "and" onto the bottom line because there's that comma. So shift and enter, use your tab key to shift them around. Place this towards the end of the line, kind of makes it quite straightforward to read here. I'm just going to shrink the text box to fit it all. So from this point, drag it along that line, Once again, I'm just going to bring in this other text box we've got from the original. Now, I've repeated the same kind of steps on this. I've just made a much longer, in terms of width, I've made a much wider text box here. You can see as there's a comma coming into the full stop at the end of the sentence, that's the time to put in the line break. So then the ground doesn't hold you. Once again, it merely interrupts is on the line below. Just use Shift-Enter and your Tab key to create these indents. Okay, now for the kind of grand title here, with this combination of free typefaces. I'm just going to move these in. So this is using the same typefaces as well as Helvetica. So first thing I'm going to do is copy this greater good title now, and I'm going to type in further. And then with this kind of negative tracking going on, you see how it's all tight and compressed. I'm going to change this into an italic, and I'm going to kind of shift this maybe just around the height of this bottom line of text. I'm just going to increase the weight of this slightly, turn this to a light italic. Then I'm going to type in further again. Well, actually, no, I'm just going to duplicate this, and I'm going to change this to Helvetica now display. Actually, I'm going to change this to bold. Now, as I increase this in size, I'm going to start to look for openings of where I can fit the typeface within the rest of the negative space of the type. So just dragging this kind of into the corner of the H, so you can still read it as the word further, but you've got some good negative spacing going on there. I'm just going to shift these both over a little bit. Now, the idea of this was that it's going to try and read as further and further and further, so I've, incorporate these arrows that, as well as kind of pointing towards the image, they also kind of help with readability because they're just pushing you to the next line where the next set of arrows are. And now just to put in this kind of a ampersand here, I'm going to duplicate this and type it in by using Shift and 7. Now, I want to change this to Ivy Presto again, and I want to get it to a light weight. Now, my idea with this is that if it is big enough, it's going to be a good balance between the rest of the letters, but enough so that when I outline it, it's still clearly readable. So with this layer selected, I'm going to add a white stroke, set this to inside, press OK at around 4 points, and then set the fill to 0. So now you can see using this just as an outline, it kind of takes away from the contrast, which is good, which makes you focus more just on the lettering. Now with this further typeface here, I'm going to use Command J, duplicate this, and I'm going to capitalize this in the settings, and I'm going to change the weight up to extra bold. Now this is going to help us with contrast here. Now you can see that with this tracking, we've got some kind of weird spacing going on. So between this F and this U, I'm going to adjust the kerning using Option and my arrow keys. So now this doesn't need to be perfect. I'm not really trying to make it kind of equally spaced. I'm trying to make it optically spaced. Now, this can be a challenge. So I think my safe bet is kind of bring them in slightly closer, kind of all round. Bring in this space here, slightly increase that. Now, the only thing is that it's going to jump in large sets. So if you come into this kind of a kerning box here, you can type in values because it only jumps in increments of 20. So now I'm just going to duplicate this, bring this down, get rid of the THER in that text box and the fur in that one. So now, as I can scale this up, we can now structure these so that one is on the left-hand side and one is below. So I'm going to select both of these type layers and I'm going to adjust the size to about 130, maybe even 145 here. No, slightly smaller. Let's go for 140. And now we're just working around placement. So I'm going to move this in, try and match the leading between the top line and the middle line. And I also want the bottom of the R to be the bottom of the ampersand. Now remember, we don't want it on this kind of bottom curve here because these are the kind of overlap portions of the lettering. So I'm just going to increase that slightly, or move it up slightly, and then do the same with this line here. Now again, I want the end of the R to kind of align with the end of the ampersand just for kind of just supporting the grid. I'm going to slightly reduce this to try and match. And there we go, that's good for now. Now just bringing in this last text box here, repeat the same step as the previous, except at the end here I've changed the typeface to Helvetica now. So once again, use the tabs and the Shift Enter as the indents to kind of structure this line. And now just mess around with your placement. Obviously what I've kind of gone for here is this diagonal line that follows through the piece. So it's the direction of reading. You can see in this original, we've got a little bit of tighter spacing here. So I'm just going to play around with that. I'm going to bring this greater good, well actually I'm just going to highlight all of the text on the bottom half. I'm going to bring this all up slightly to line up with the bottom of this grid line. Now from this point, this has got a little bit more of clear readability in terms of direction. I'm also just going to highlight this top half and I'm going to move it over slightly just to kind of increase that. Okay, and there we go. We've got our type in, so now we can just move on to these kind of assets and images and shapes and textures and all that good stuff. So I wanted to throw in a word here about why I feel like this typographic layout works and what I'm looking for when I'm creating these kind of things. So the main thing you have to consider is scale and contrast. Everyone knows that the human eye reads left to right and top to bottom. But this typeface is so bold and there is so much contrast in sizing and weights between these three that this is going to be the first thing that the eye jumps to. So even though I have this directional line leading through, naturally, you see as I scale out, the first thing you see is this further text here. So although I have a combination of weights and contrast, There's some contrast here between the thin typeface and the regular. Obviously the most contrast here is there's so much difference in weight from bold to light, and slightly here in sizing, it's still going to be this that the eye is naturally drawn to. So now I need to think about in the layout how I'm going to work around this to adjust it and make sure that I can make people read in the line directionally. So I considered using shapes and assets. So for example, in this case, I've used the arrows. So as I move back onto the original, you can see I've got this kind of directional line that's constructed of shapes here that kind of leads you to the start of the line. And I think with this overlay, even when you zoom out, you know, this still is the largest typeface. So now with these shapes in mind, I thought what's going to draw the eye to the top left corner first. So I thought creating this directional arrow that's effectively the start point of the piece, as well as I considered reducing the contrast in this area. Now, the way I considered reducing it was by adding in some similar weighted assets. So for example here, these arrows are the same weight as the typeface. So when I zoom out, it doesn't stand out as much because there is less contrast between the text and the background. It almost just looks like a big bold blur at this scale. So I thought, okay, right, as soon as I zoom in, what's the first thing my eye gets drawn to? Now, these arrows are clearly quite large and prominent and directing you towards the image, but that is fine because I think once you've seen the image or you've seen anything in this area, you realize it's following a line, you then go to the top corner and you read from there. So you just have to consider how people are viewing it from the start to finish and whether you think that the content is ordered well enough for it to be read in the right purpose. So I'm just going to add in these assets now. As I look at this original, I think that if I was to remake this, I may try and make this top arrow slightly bigger or slightly thicker so that it may take more of your attention towards this area of the piece. So I'm going to show you that I've gone down to the shape tool, open my grid lines back up as a reference, and I'm just going to make this the width of the columns. Now using this bar, you can see what I mean when I talk about contrast. Now as I zoom out, even though this text is quite large here, you know, I haven't added the arrows yet, so it's less, you know, this still has quite high contrast, but you know, it's big white beam against a black background. That's bringing contrast in. So I'm also going to add in this triangle here. So I'm going to shape some triangles, direct them towards the start of the text, and I'm just going to scale them slightly within the rectangle lines. So I'm just going to make this as a black fill for the moment, just so we can visualize it. I'm going to duplicate this to the ends and just keep doing this until it reaches the end of the bar. Bring this in slightly to make it easier. So you can see already, like, although it may not be the prettiest asset, I mean, that's your goal here. You have to make it look as if it's, you know, belonging within the piece and it's comprehensive rather than just putting in a direct arrow, you know? So I thought, okay, let me maybe shrink this down so it's a bit more of a negative space thing. So it's still some kind of an asset, but it looks more like a deliberate pattern. So then what I've done with this is I'm going to group all of the triangles here, and I'm just going to create a duplicate layer just so I can select them all. So I'm going to use Command E to combine that. Command click on the icon so I can select all of the triangles, and then I'm going to mask these in the rectangle. Now, I'm just going to use Command I to invert that selection. And now with this, if I was to do it slightly differently, I may put a larger end on this arrow. So you can see in the original, I've got this kind of triple arrow going on here. Now the way I've done this is, so I'm just going to delete those now that I've got this rectangle. I'm going to add in a triangle shape, turn it, duplicate, and drag this slightly into itself. Command click on the icon image and then mask it on the triangle. So I need to invert it now so we can see it. Now this is going to be our arrow shape. So I'm going to convert this to a smart object so that we can now just have this itself as an asset. Duplicate, shrink it within itself, repeat the same step. And there we go, we've got this here. So now I can group these three. Now this can be our triangle shape. So on this, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out one portion here at the end. So I'm going to mask this out, get our triangle shape here. I'm going to find a way to balance this in. I wonder if I can make it the same height as the bar. Yes, it's kind of constructed. This could work in this way. Yeah, I think as I zoom out, I quite like that. I think I'm going to make this slightly shorter, you know, and then also I'm going to move this to the left slightly so that it has more contrast, you know. It's around more of a black background rather than next to more white text. So it stands out more by itself. Now this is going to bring your eye towards it. So once again, just play around with this placement. I'm going to say there is good for me. And now with this triangle shape we've made previously, I'm going to duplicate that, drag this out of the folder so that we can put them in separate areas. And now I'm going to increase this to the height of this further text here. So with this, duplicate, move across. I'm going to group these as well, duplicate that, end of this line here. And then drag this one next to the ampersand here, drag the second one just before this text. Now I'm going to make sure just to focus on these small details, line this up with the F. There we go. Now just in order of constructing these triangles down here, my thought process with this was, you know, we've got really heavy typographic top half of this image, and I'm thinking bottom wise, my initial concept for this poster was the sense of gravity. So I thought, you know, having this kind of layer along the bottom of almost like ground spikes. So if you land there, you've got a problem. With this ground spike content, I thought, let's make it, you know, not too literal where it's kind of just pointing upwards. I thought, let's just have these arrows aiming down. So once again, I'm going to duplicate this, turn this to face downwards. And now you can see here, this is where the columns come into play really well. So I'm just going to scale this to the size of the column, near enough. Now I can just use my shift key to drag this in so that it fits perfectly. And I'm going to duplicate and turn this. And now I'm going to shrink this down until it's the center. And I'm going to line up this point with the bottom of the V. Once again, duplicate. And now I want to rotate this and do the same thing on the other side. Now with these made, I'm going to put all three of these in the same folder. So once again, highlight them all, Command G, and I'm going to name this bottom arrows. So now if I'm going to put a stroke on this folder, just an inside stroke, and I'm going to set the fill to 0. Now with this made, I didn't want it too heavy to bring contrast, so that's why I've made it just an outline, because once again, if I made it a big, heavy white blocks along the whole bottom, that's going to be what your eyes drawn to first. Now with this, keep my grid lines open, duplicate and fill each of these boxes. There we go. Now it's this nice kind of supporting asset along the bottom, but it doesn't take too much attention away from the main typography. So I group these in, keep them all organized. I can say that, but I haven't really done that with the rest of my work. So now with this, we can just move into the image here, which is the final piece before the texturing. So let's paste in this image file. See, I will link the photographer in the description. This is what I've got from Unsplash, and it's Mark Williams, I believe. So now with this image, what I've done is first looking at it, I've realized, okay, it's got this cool vertical format with this somewhat plain background. So with this gravity concept I've got going on, all of the arrows pointing to the right, I think that almost make it seem as if gravity isn't just pulling down, it's pulling against the right-hand side. So let's have him slightly out of the frame. So I'm going to move him under all of the layers. And I thought if the arrows point directly towards his face and the arms kind of line up really well with the typeface and the direction of it, then that's perfect. Then that's all that I need. So I played around with the scale here for a little while, and I could add in a slight tilt, which doesn't take too much away from the sense of pushing, and I'm going to move him just out of frame slightly. And there we go. With this, I thought very simple effect. I'm just sticking with a duotone colorway here. So I've just come down to adjustments, added a threshold layer. Now, a way to spruce up a threshold layer is by adding a grain overlay below it. It creates this kind of Xerox look. So you can see here, there's not too much detail going on. Now I can adjust the threshold value, but I'm quite happy with where it is for the moment. So I'm just going to undo it back to where it was. And now in between the threshold layer and the image, I'm going to come down to adjustments, solid color. I'm going to type in 80, 80, 80, convert this to a smart object, come up to camera raw filter, and I'm going to add noise. So on grain here, I'm going to set it to 100. I'm going to set the size to 100 as well, because the larger grain here, the better it looks. Set the roughness to 50. So now this is going to look very leery to start with, but what I'm going to do, set this to overlay. Now you can see, as I hide and reveal this layer, we've got this large, thick, grainy effect coming through on the image. Now with this added, you can see this kind of texture look I've got going on here. Now this is made up just of some very simple effects. This is just a few texture overlays, some levels. So the first thing I'm going to do is work in the gradient map. So I didn't want it to be solid black, solid white. That's boring to me. So I'm going to structure it into this kind of off-white and off-gray. Now the first thing I'm going to do is group all of my layers here that is typographic or assets. Now the reason for this is because I'm going to add like a drop shadow effect, which kind of heightens this ink bleed look whenever you add a gradient map. So with all of these layers grouped, come down to effects and drop shadow. Now I'm going to use a white drop shadow here. You can see I'm going to set the size to 2. Then I'm going to press this plus icon to duplicate it. But I believe as I already have so many duplicates here, then that's probably the reason it's not letting me do it. With that duplicate, I'm going to set this to 4. So just keep doubling it. And now as I keep doubling this, so 8, 16, 32, 64, you get it, go so on and so on and so on. Already now, this is very vibrant, very thick. So I'm just going to take some weight away by just removing some. Just doing that more as a showcase of what you're doing there. So now, even with this subtle glow on, you're going to notice the effect that it has. So let me come down to adjustments, gradient map. Make sure the icon is selected rather than the mask. And then I'm going to set this as my preset color. So now this is, I'm just going to show you the colors. Come into these blue hues, drag it slightly up from a solid black and get into more of a darker gray. Same kind of thing with the whites, except just slightly in from white along this orange hue. So now as I zoom back into this text, it's quite subtle, but it kind of creates this bleeding effect around the text. You can see as I add and remove drop shadows, it's going to increase and decrease. It's better to view it with the gradient map on. It kind of creates depth between the text and the background, but I'm just going to keep it at 3 drop shadows for the moment and then work in our texture layers. So paste it in. Now this is a photocopy texture I've got from Texture Fabric. Now this is a free texture. I'll link it in the description. My first step was putting this onto layer mode screen. Now this is a standard for when I'm working with poster design. I always start with a layer mode screen as it kind of covers the majority of the background, and then you can focus on the text. So with this selected, I think I'm going to go down to around 50% opacity. And all I'm looking at now is the color of the background and where I want that placed. I'm also going to drag this texture underneath the gradient map so that it's colored within and comprehensively across the whole piece. Now, for me, for the moment, I think the background looks a little bit too gray, a little bit too vibrant. So I'm going to bring the opacity down a bit more to about 40. Now, I also want to increase the contrast. As of right now, it's a very flat looking layer. I'm going to use Command L, drag in the dark values and drag the midtones to kind of counter these. And now if you look towards the top of the piece here, these kind of like light and folds, you see as I drag these away, they release, drag them closer, they become more prominent. So I want to bring this texture out whilst keep maintaining contrast. So about here is good for me. And now I need to mimic this on the text, but make it look realistic. So it's going to have to be a fair bit darker than it is at the moment. So I'm going to duplicate this layer, set it to exclusion. So now already as I set it to exclusion, you can see it's applying over this light value now. It's looking a bit more comprehensive, but it's still not quite there. So with this layer, I'm going to keep it on 50, but I need to play around with the contrast so it's not as harsh. So I'm going to drag these midtones in. So if I drag the dark values out a bit, midtones towards the right, you've really got to find the balance here, and it can be quite difficult. I remember I spent quite a long time playing around with this, trying to get this right. So I think here's good for me. Now the reason is because if I reduce the opacity, it helps a lot more with the background, but keeps the info on the text. So now with this overlaid, I'm going to add in just a general levels layer to try and balance this because I want it to be darker, but still maintain the detail on the text. See, that's good. See, as I bring in the dark value so that we get a darker background, bring the midtones over to the right, you can see text has so much more contrast. So now I'll just find that midpoint of where we can balance it with the background and the text. Say about here is quite good. And now we're just moving into the final territory now. I'm just going to add in a noise overlay. So as I've got one already here, I'm going to duplicate it, move it to the top, and then I can just play around with the actual settings. So I want this noise to be a lot smaller. So size 20, keep the roughness at 50. And now as I hide and reveal this, it just adds in this extra detail, giving even more of an analog look. And there is our final design. Now, as always, you're a legend for making it to the very end of the video. Now, YouTube's gonna recommend you another one it thinks you need to see just here. So go ahead and watch that, and I'll see you in my next video.